California officials have been warning that if even more refineries shut down, the state could reach a point where there is no way back. What often gets overlooked is that Oregon passed that point years ago. Nearly 2 decades back, the state crossed that line quietly, and since then there has been no return. With no refineries left, Oregon now depends entirely on fuel brought in from outside its borders. Emergency orders from Governor Kotek cannot revive an industry that was dismantled long ago through policy choices. That raises a larger question. What actually happens when a state tears down its entire fuel system? In energy planning terms, the point of no return is the moment when keeping a refining industry alive is no longer realistic. It is not about a single plant closing its doors. It is about a chain reaction that cannot be reversed. When a refinery shuts down for good, the workforce does not wait around. Engineers, operators, maintenance staff, and safety experts move on to other jobs, often in other states. The loss is not limited to people. Specialized equipment is taken apart, sold off, or scrapped altogether. As time passes, local expertise fades, supplier networks dissolve, and day-to-day operational knowledge disappears. Starting over later is not as simple as building new structures and buying machinery. The regulatory process alone can take 3 to 5 years as permits move through environmental reviews and public hearings. Even if approval is granted, construction can take another 5 to 7 years. By then, the original workforce is gone, and replacing it requires years of training. On top of that, the cost of building a modern refinery can exceed $7 billion. That level of investment is difficult to justify, especially in states with strict fuel regulations and long-term net zero targets. Industry analysts have warned that once a refinery has been idle for 5 to 10 years, restarting it becomes extremely difficult. In fact, no refinery in the United States that has sat unused for a full decade has ever returned to operation. At that point, a region becomes locked into permanent dependence on fuel supplied from elsewhere. In Oregon, the loss of refining capacity did not happen with headlines or public debate. It unfolded quietly. For decades, the state relied on a single small refinery in Portland. Compared to the large facilities operating along the West Coast, it was limited in size and output. During the 1980s and 1990s, that refinery continued running while larger plants in other states shut down or merged. Oregon never expanded beyond that lone facility. By the early 2000s, financial pressures intensified. The Portland refinery, producing roughly 10,000 barrels per day, began to struggle. The turning point came in November 2006, when the owners announced plans to shut it down. 2 years later, in December 2008, the final barrels were processed, sealing the refinery's permanent closure. From that moment on, Oregon no longer had any refining capacity. The workers who once kept the plant running dispersed, finding jobs elsewhere. Equipment was left unused, dismantled, or repurposed. Over time, the site slipped out of public memory. Without much notice, the state crossed a line it could not step back from. Whether the closure was driven by economics or a slow regulatory environment, the impact was undeniable. With a single shutdown, Oregon became fully dependent on fuel from outside its borders. Today, the state consumes roughly 100,000 barrels of gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel each day, while producing none of it locally. More than 90% of Oregon's fuel demand is supplied by the Olympic Pipeline, a 400-mile system that carries fuel from refineries in Washington down to terminals along the Willamette River in Portland. Those terminals are critical. They distribute fuel to tanker trucks, smaller pipelines, and barges that move supplies farther south. The remaining share, roughly 10%, arrives by barge or rail, mostly from California or Canada. But that source offers little real security. Every gas station, farm, airport, and military facility in Oregon depends on the Olympic pipeline and the steady production of Washington's refineries. There are no alternative pipelines bringing fuel into the state. There is no local refining, and there are no strategic reserves large enough to absorb a serious interruption. If the Olympic pipeline were to shut down, or if Washington's refineries ran into trouble, Oregon's fuel supply could drop to near zero in a matter of hours. That leaves the state in a fragile position. The entire system hinges on a small number of critical links, with almost no margin for error. This goes far beyond convenience. It is a structural weakness that exposes Oregon to sudden price spikes, shortages, and supply chain disruptions that cannot be resolved quickly. That vulnerability became impossible to ignore on November 24, 2025, when a leak was discovered in the Olympic pipeline. The line that supplies Oregon's gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel was forced to shut down. Events moved fast. As soon as the flow stopped, operations were halted. Within hours, reports from fuel terminals in Portland showed inventories falling and supplies tightening. Trucks began lining up at distribution terminals, but there was nothing for them to haul. Barge operators were flooded with calls, yet almost all available capacity was already booked. With no crude production inside the state and no refineries left, every gallon depended on that single pipeline from Washington. Before midday, Governor Tina Kotek declared a state of emergency, setting off a rushed response across state agencies. Her administration moved quickly to find alternatives. Teams contacted trucking firms across the Pacific Northwest and tried to secure barge space from California and Canada. Each option came at a steep price. Trucking fuel meant recruiting hundreds of drivers and pushing more traffic onto already crowded highways. Barges required days to load, transit, and unload, and even then they could deliver only a small share of what the pipeline supplied each day. Fuel retailers began warning customers about possible rationing. Farmers and emergency services pressed for priority access. Behind the scenes, logistics coordinators worked nonstop, tracing every possible route that might keep critical operations running. The situation was blunt and unavoidable. Oregon's economy, from airports to ambulances, was balanced on a single supply line that could fail without warning. The response exposed how deeply the state had come to rely on out-of-state refineries and a supply system with no real backup. Emergency orders helped move resources faster, but they could not replace lost refining capacity or restore the local production that once gave Oregon a margin of safety. With every hour the pipeline stayed offline, the risks became clearer, and the cost of relying on a single source grew harder to ignore. 15 years after Oregon's last refinery shut down, the idea of rebuilding no longer feels remote. It feels out of reach. The permitting process alone would stretch 3 to 5 years. Construction would add at least 5 more. A single refinery capable of meeting the state's needs would require an investment exceeding $7 billion. The workforce that once ran the Portland facility is gone. Engineers and operators have moved on, taken jobs elsewhere, or retired altogether. The equipment did not wait. It was dismantled, reused, or left to deteriorate. Even if a company were willing to absorb the upfront costs, Oregon's environmental rules and long-term net zero targets create additional barriers that few investors are willing to face. That leaves the state boxed in with no signs of relief ahead. Corporate strategy across the energy sector has shifted away from new fossil fuel investments. One example stands out. Phillips 66 has begun selling off billions of dollars in assets along the West Coast, including the Ferndale Refinery in Washington. That facility produces roughly 105,000 barrels per day and supplies essentially all of Oregon's daily fuel demand. Its future is now uncertain. If Ferndale were to close, the Olympic pipeline would have nothing left to transport. For now, gasoline prices sit near $3.82 per gallon. If California's supply were disrupted, prices could climb to $5 or $6 per gallon without much resistance. Should Washington's refineries begin shutting down as well, analysts warn pump prices could rise to $7 or even $8. In a worst-case scenario, another pipeline failure or a shift toward fuel imports from Asia could push prices to $9 or even $12 per gallon. Patrick DeHaan, a leading fuel price analyst, has been blunt about the risks. He says Oregon is in a weaker position than California because California still has refineries operating within its borders. When a state eliminates all of its refining capacity decades earlier, it leaves itself exposed to decisions and disruptions beyond its control. For Oregon families, the impact would be immediate. At $7 per gallon, the average household would spend close to $4,000 more each year on fuel, money that disappears one fill-up at a time. Military installations across the state face similar risks. A single disruption in the supply chain could force operations to slow or stop altogether. These warnings are no longer hypothetical. With no realistic path to rebuilding, Oregon's energy future is shaped by choices made outside the state. The situation makes one reality clear. Once critical infrastructure is gone, there is no quick solution, only lasting exposure. As refineries across the West Coast continue to close, fuel security stops being an abstract policy debate. It becomes something felt every day. The lesson is simple. What is lost through years of neglect cannot be restored with an emergency order.